Hello. Thanks for joining me. I woke up this morning and I felt like God was saying to share a message, something that He showed me a couple of years back. I haven't shared it with a lot of people. It was kind of heavy, but I felt like God was saying, I want you to release it because there's going to be people that are going to get freed up from hearing it. And I know that God answered a lot of questions in my heart when He showed me the story that I'm going to share. But I'm going to share it out of chronological order. I'm going to share with you something that happened a long time ago after I share something that happened a couple of years ago. But I was serving as a pastor at a church, and I hadn't been to church in probably 9 years, but I had been, seeking God and hanging out with God, praying and getting together with small groups and stuff like that. So when God was saying, hey, I'm going to bring you back into church and I'm asking you to serve here, it was just, really kind of new for me. I'd grown up in church, but just seeing the inner workings of church was so interesting to me. And I can remember there was a time when the church, things were really kind of coming unraveled and things were getting exposed and just things were kind of getting really dismantled. And I knew that it was God and I knew that it was good, because I think a lot of the times we look at the Holy Spirit as coming in and just making us feel good, but the Holy Spirit actually comes in like a tornado and He'll tear things apart that aren't Jesus, not to punish us, but to set us free so He can come in and fill those areas where we've been putting faith in things that are outside of Jesus. And so I was kind of watching this happen at the church, and some of my really close friends were in leadership there and had birthed this church from nothing basically. And I can remember just all the things that were going on, and I was in prayer one night and God took me into a vision and I saw this solitary confinement prison cell. And I saw this person that was in there and they were just barely alive. They were barely getting enough food to survive. There was no sunlight. There was no, social interaction. And I saw they got released and then they were in general population and they were hanging out with other prisoners and they were playing basketball, working out, fights, the whole 9 yards. But to them, compared to solitary confinement, it was amazing. And I was on the outside looking in at all of this, and God was saying, people that have been in the world and they've been just getting totally oppressed and they're barely alive, He was saying it's like a solitary confinement cell. And He said, and then when they give their lives to me and then they come into church, He said, even though they don't realize they could still be in a prison, a religious prison, where they're trying to get right with God through their own strength, or they're being taught, not just faith in Jesus, but all of these other theologies, and it's laying this heavy load on them. They're actually still in prison. And God was saying, and by, my mercy and grace, His mercy and grace, He's all, I brought you into a place of freedom, not because I've deserved it or earned it, and I'm sure there's still a lot more freedom God's taking me into. But He said, I'm taking you from the outside in, and you're encountering people that will fight with everything that's in them to defend what freedom looks like to them. And I thought, oh my gosh, God, it's so true. And He was saying, so just continue to stay in faith and continue to love them where they're at, whether they're leaders in the church, pastors, or whether it's somebody that's just coming to church. Continue to love them where they're at. And I'm using you and others like you to invite them into freedom. And I thought, man, God, that's so crazy. And He was saying what happens at churches a lot of the time, He said the leadership have been taught, okay, this is how you run a church. And we need to make things, we need to be there for the people. We need to have lots of structure. We need things to be in order to make God look good. And this is how we're going to serve people. And what we don't realize is when we're doing it in our own strength, we're trying to help God help people, there's no Jesus in it. There's no Holy Spirit, because we're not trusting Jesus and allowing Him to lead us by the power of the Holy Spirit. We're actually putting faith and our ability to help God instead of humbly trusting Jesus so we can be led by his agenda. And it's scary for us because it means we have to relinquish control. And I was seeing, like in some churches, the leadership, and God was speaking to me. I was, like I said, serving as a pastor at this time. God was saying, you'll become a warden, and you're actually keeping people imprisoned because you're, redirecting them to what they need to do for God as opposed to what Jesus has done for them and his worthiness to be trusted. And he said, in a lot of churches, he said they look like churches in the physical, but in the spirit, they actually look like prisons. And I thought, man, God, that is such a gnarly word. And he was saying, men's good intentions keep the spirit of religion in the church and keep the Holy Spirit out. But those that are walking in humility and trusting Jesus with every thought, with every decision, they're allowing God to lead them instead of them trying to lead God. And it was a really humbling picture, but it was actually really life-giving because I knew God was saying, your job is to simply trust me with my church and love them where they're at. It'll invite them into the freedom you've experienced through your simple faith in me. And I thought, man, God, that's so cool. And then the power of the Holy Spirit to free people where they're at. And isn't that, what we all look for, is to be the good news to the people that are around us? And so go back in time. I was 25, which is only a couple years ago. Just kidding. But I was 25, and I can remember I sat on the edge of my bed, and I had grown up going to church, and my dad was a pastor and stuff like that. But I had a really kind of bad taste in my mouth for the church, and I had this encounter with God, and he said, do you know what you hated growing up about church? And I said, yeah, God, let me bust out my list, I said, I hated, all of the people that were really nice at church, but really mean outside of church, just the masks that I could see at church, and just all of this stuff that was going on that I really didn't feel like was God. And God said, no, what you didn't like about church was you. And I said, why me? And he said, you didn't like the people that were going to church and they were aware of the problem, but they weren't willing to do anything about it. And I thought, oh man, that's so true, And God said, I was faithfully working at that church that you grew up in. And he said, but instead of glorifying me for what I was doing, you were glorifying the enemy for what he was doing at that church, being his witness instead of mine. And he said, stop judging the church, stop judging the bride, and lay down your life and serve her. And from that time on, God totally had me turn, and I got set free from all this judgment I had against the church. And that's not to say that word God gave me about a lot of churches in the spirit, they're prisons. And he's saying, I trust you with that information because you're not going to use it to judge people. You're going to use that information to lay down your life and be an invitation for people to get set free. And, go back to that time that God gave me that word about the prison. God said something after he showed me that whole prison picture. He said, don't sympathize with the enemy. And I was like, whoa, what does that even mean, God? And he wasn't talking about the people, the leadership, or the people that were going to church. He was saying, don't sympathize with the enemy. Don't sympathize with the spirit of religion. And he said, I'm not dismantling churches, I'm dismantling prisons. And I know that's a word for the church today, that God is dismantling by his mercy. He's showing us all of the things that we've tried to build in our own strength and ability to try to help God. He's allowing those things to get all torn down, that we're building on nothing but our faith in Jesus. And in Matthew 16:18, where, Jesus is asking the disciples, who do people say that I am? And then he asked them, who do you guys say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, you got that information from the Father. That wasn't from men, And he said, and on this rock I will build my church, and hell won't prevail against it. And I know that's exactly what God's doing by his love for the body, by his love for his bride. He's dismantling all of the things that have been built on human reasoning and men's best efforts, so the church will be built on nothing but our simplistic faith in Jesus. And I know a lot of people, like in my life, and I can totally relate because I was there for many years, they've had a really hard time with the church because they've gone to church and they've bought into the whole system, and then they get hurt. And then they start feeling like rejection, and they start blaming God, or they start blaming the church. But it wasn't the church's fault. They were under the same thing that I was under. They started judging the bride because they were going to church to get something instead of going to church to give something. And the word says when you're going and you're getting together in fellowship, have something to give. And I know God's tearing apart that whole system to where people that are in prison in churches are getting set free through simple faith in Jesus. But also people that are in prisons that aren't going to churches are getting set free as they're laying down their judgment against the church, and they're praying for the church, and they're glorifying God for what he is doing in the church as an invitation to those people on the inside getting set free. And we get to be the vessels of the very good news because we're all part of the capital C church. And I know God's equipping us to carry that good news, whether you've been hurt by the church and it's kind of kept you out of the church and it's kind of kept you isolated and just, oppressed, or whether you're in the church and you're doing your best to try to serve God, but you're just not feeling and experiencing the Holy Spirit. So I hope that made sense, and I hope it blessed you guys. Thanks for listening.